The sharp winter light bounced off the academy's marble facade, almost blinding in its brilliance. Flags lined the walkway like silent sentries, their colors snapping in the wind. Beyond the iron gate, brass instruments warmed up, their notes drifting over the hum of conversation. Men and women in dress blues and polished shoes moved with precision, their movements choreographed by years of tradition. My name wasn't on the guest list. I knew it the moment the young guard at the gate scanned his tablet, glanced at my military ID, and then back to me with a polite, uneasy frown. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low but firm, "your name isn't authorized for entry." I didn't flinch. "This is for the Operation Resolute Spear ceremony, correct?" "Yes, ma'am. Active and honorary mentions only." His thumb hovered over the screen, as if stalling for a miracle. The air smelled faintly of leather polish and cold steel. Beyond the gates, I could see my family already mingling. My mother, pearls gleaming under the winter sun, laughed softly at something my brother said. Lucas was at the center of it all, his uniform tailored to perfection, his voice carrying over the crowd in that rehearsed, self-assured cadence. I doubted he'd seen me yet. I had driven here without announcing my arrival, the same way I'd lived most of my life in this family, unseen unless summoned. It wasn't the first time they'd decided where I did and didn't belong. When I graduated with honors from West Point, my father had been too busy with court, and my mother sent flowers instead of showing up. Lucas had texted a single word: "Congrats." Over the years, they'd perfected the art of excluding me without ever saying the words out loud. The guard shifted, his boots crunching against the frozen gravel. "Do you have a printed invitation?" "No," I said flatly. The truth was, the invitation had arrived only 3 days earlier, unsigned except for a note in my mother's handwriting. "We hope you'll join us, Grace. It's a family milestone." No mention of my role in the operation they were celebrating. No apology for the years of silence. From inside the gate, I could see guests in tailored suits and formal dresses filing toward the main hall. A young boy adjusted his tie while his father shook hands with an officer. Laughter rolled over the courtyard like a tide, warm and familiar, for them. I stood on the outside, my breath clouding in the cold, every exhale a reminder that I was not supposed to be here. The guard cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but without authorization." "She's with me." The voice came from inside the courtyard, steady and unyielding. Heads turned. Standing just past the gate was a Deshan woman in a navy wool coat, a cane in one hand, her back impossibly straight despite her age. Margaret Hallberg, my grandmother. She didn't raise her voice, but every syllable carried the weight of command. "She's a Hallberg," she said, eyes fixed on the guard. "She belongs here." For a second, no one moved. The wind rattled the flags overhead. The guard looked, from her to me, caught between the protocol he was trained to uphold and the authority radiating from the woman in front of him. Finally, he stepped aside. As I walked through the gate, the conversations around us shifted. Some paused, others lowered to whispers. I kept my head high, each step measured. The ceremony hadn't started yet, but the battle for my place here already had. And thanks to Margaret, I'd just won the first round. 4 years earlier, the desert sun over Hawthorne had been merciless. Heat shimmered off the rocks, radios hissed with static, and the air smelled faintly of gun oil and dust. I was the commanding officer on the ground, not in title yet, but in every way that mattered. My unit was running low on drone support, comms were down, and the southern flank was collapsing fast. From the ridge, I could see the narrow corridor. That was our only chance of stabilizing the front. One wrong call and 200 soldiers wouldn't make it out. I had made the decision in seconds. We would split, 2 units converging in a pincer maneuver while I coordinated from the drone blind. It was a gamble, high risk, no backup, No way to predict how long the window would stay open. But the maneuver worked. We reclaimed Sector 3, stabilized the evacuation route, and brought every one of our wounded out alive. Back at base, my after-action report was thorough, down to the last coordinate and call sign. I'd written the tactical overlays myself, drawn from maps I'd annotated in the field. I'd signed the report in black ink, my name crisp beneath the title, Commanding Officer, Lieutenant Cole Grace Hallberg. Months later, after the mission was declassified, I logged into the secure archive expecting to see the final record. My name wasn't there. Instead, the commanding officer line read, Captain Lucas Hallberg. My maps were still there, my phrasing untouched in the daily situation reports, but my signature had vanished. The metadata told the rest of the story. The file had been edited 5 months after submission, around the same time I'd been promoted and quietly asked the department not to publicize it. Not because I was ashamed, but because Lucas was still junior and I didn't want to overshadow him. Now I saw the cost of that kindness. The deeper I dug, the more deliberate it became. Speech transcripts lifted word for word from my debriefings were now attached to Lucas's name. Tactical overlay still carried my handwriting in the original layers, but the visible credit had been replaced. Even the mission commendation citation, the one I had refused to attend because it was his night, described decisions I'd made, risks I'd taken, as though I'd been a bystander. And this wasn't some lazy clerical mistake. I traced the document history. Revisions routed through a private server belonging to my father's law office. It was all too neat. Timestamps that lined up with policy meetings my father attended. Changes tagged as formatting adjustments that somehow always erased me and elevated Lucas. Professionally, it was a betrayal that cut deeper than any tactical loss. In our world, the record is everything. What you've commanded, where you've served, the risks you've taken. It's your currency, your credibility, your legacy. Without it, you're invisible. Personally, it was worse. My family hadn't just failed to defend me. They'd orchestrated the rewrite. Lucas stood on podiums, delivering speeches I'd written, reciting my battlefield strategies as though he'd lived them. My parents smiled in the front row, never once correcting the record. And I, the one who'd lived those decisions in. The dust and heat had become a ghost in my own story. That was the thing about erasure. It didn't come with an announcement. It happened in quiet edits, in the absence of your name where it should have been, in the polite refusal to acknowledge what everyone knew to be true. It wasn't just that they'd stolen credit. They'd built a new history without me, and then acted like it had always been that way. I didn't know it yet. But the day I opened that altered report was the day I stopped being willing to stay silent. It was Rowe who tipped me off. A short, clipped message in my inbox, marked priority. Check the Hawthorne archive, there's a window. By the time I logged in, my pulse was already quickening. The secure portal wasn't supposed to allow access to prior file versions without clearance. But someone, maybe Rowe, maybe another quiet ally, had opened the gate for me. I clicked through the index until I found it, the original unedited Operation Hawthorne dossier, the screen filled with familiar details, my tactical maps annotated in my own shorthand, arrows drawn in red where the flank had collapsed, dotted lines marking the pincer maneuver that turned the tide. The comms logs scrolled down the page, my voice threaded through the static, issuing orders, adjusting positions, refusing to abandon a pinned squad until we had confirmation they were moving. And then, at the bottom of the after-action report, my name, my signature, the date stamp. It wasn't just evidence, it was irrefutable history. I downloaded the entire file set, copied the metadata extract, and backed everything up to a secure drive. Every log, every revision note, every IP address that had touched the document since submission. If they tried to bury it again, They'd have to bury every copy. Everywhere. 2 days later, I sat across from General Hargrave in his office. The blinds were half closed, stripes of light falling across the table between us. He had the original dossier open in front of him, glasses low on his nose as he flipped through the pages. "I've seen a lot of edited records in my career," he said finally. "But this was a surgical removal." I stayed quiet. "You want to go public?" His tone was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. "No," I said. "I don't want a speech. I don't want applause. I want the record corrected, permanently." He studied me for a moment, as if measuring the weight of my answer. "You understand that once it's corrected, it's going to ripple. Promotions, commendations, citations, they'll all shift." "Then let them shift," I said. "But I don't want to look like someone who's showing up late to claim credit. I want the truth to stand without me having to sell it." He leaned back, folded his hands over the folder, and gave the smallest nod. "Let's give them a name they tried to erase." The agreement was silent, but final. I knew in that moment that the lie's days were numbered. The only question left was how and when the truth would break the surface. The rehearsal didn't have the pomp of the main event, but it still carried weight. The auditorium smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood, the kind that had absorbed decades of speeches, orders, and applause. Rows of officers, aides, and production crew filled the lower seats, adjusting cameras, sound levels, and lighting cues. I slipped in quietly, taking a seat in the back row, close enough to see the stage, but far enough to be mistaken for someone's assistant. Margaret was beside me, her cane resting against the armrest, eyes fixed forward with the patience of someone who'd learned long ago that silence could be sharper than a blade. Lucas stepped onto the stage in his pressed uniform, polished shoes catching the overhead light. He carried himself like a man who had rehearsed this walk in mirrors, the deliberate pace, the confident chin tilt, the calculated pauses between each gesture. "Good afternoon," he began, voice amplified by the mic, warm enough to sound personable but formal enough to convey command. "4 years ago, during the escalation in northern Hawthorne, I found myself on a ridge overlooking the valley." I knew the story, every beat, every pivot point. I'd lived it. Now I watched him deliver my decisions like they were his memories. He spoke of enemy drones circling above, comms dead, and the impossible choice between retreat and advance. He described the pincer maneuver, gesturing to the tactical map as it lit up on the massive screen behind him. My maneuver. For a moment, it was almost surreal, hearing my own phrasing, my timing, my risk assessments, recited in a cadence I had once taught him when he was still struggling to pass officer candidate school presentations. Then it happened. The second slide appeared. The map overlay I'd created. Terrain shaded in gradients. Enemy positions marked with the codes I'd developed in the field. And in the lower right corner, small but crisp, was the credit line. Mission Strategy Architect, Lieutenant Cole G. Halberg. It was subtle, almost easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, but enough people noticed. The first murmur came from the we. Left aisle, a pair of junior officers leaning toward each other. Then another, 2 rows ahead. A decorated colonel adjusting his glasses, squinting at the screen. The air shifted, not dramatically, but just enough to change the room's center of gravity. Lucas hesitated. It was no more than a fraction of a second, but I caught it, the slight tightening at the corner of his mouth, the blink that lasted a beat too long. He glanced back at the slide, then forward again, resuming as if nothing had happened. But the crack was there now. The murmurs didn't stop. They moved like low waves through the auditorium, soft but insistent. People scribbled notes, exchanged glances, tapped on tablets. On the surface, the rehearsal continued. Cameras zoomed, spotlights tracked his movements. But underneath, the narrative was shifting. I didn't move. From the back row, I sat perfectly still, hands folded loosely in my lap. When he looked, Toward the audience, scanning for approval, I was already watching him. Our eyes met for the briefest moment. There was no anger in my gaze, no challenge, just the calm weight of someone who already knew the ending. He looked away first. Margaret leaned slightly toward me, her voice low enough for only me to hear. "They see it," she said. I kept my eyes on the stage. "Not all of it. Not yet." She smiled faintly. "That's what makes it dangerous." The rest of the rehearsal passed in a blur of technical cues and final run-throughs. Lucas regained his rhythm, the crew hit their marks, and on paper, nothing had changed. But I knew better. The first fracture in his version of history had just been carved into the record, and once it's there, it spreads. The real reveal was still coming. The lights in Arlington Hall burned brighter than they had during rehearsal, flooding every polished surface with gold. The flags behind the stage hung heavy, unmoving, as if they too were holding their breath. Rows of uniforms filled the audience, dress blues, crisp whites, rows of medals catching the light like fragments of fire. Cameras tracked smoothly along the aisles, beaming the ceremony into living rooms, briefing rooms, and forward operating bases around the world. I sat halfway down the center aisle, in the section reserved for family, my uniform jacket fitting, like a second skin. Every ribbon and bar was in place, every seam pressed flat. Beside me, Margaret sat straight-backed, her hands folded lightly over her cane, her gaze fixed on the stage. Lucas stood at the podium, delivering the opening of his speech in the same confident, measured tone he'd rehearsed. His voice carried easily. Through the hall, Operation Hawthorne tested every principle of modern warfare. With communications down and the terrain compromised, I had to make decisions that would determine the survival of over 200 soldiers. He gestured toward the screen behind him, and the now familiar tactical map appeared. The same contours I had drawn in the field, the same enemy positions marked with my codes. I braced myself for the moment the credit line appeared, wondering if it had survived this time or been stripped away at the last second. It appeared. Small, subtle, but there. Mission Strategy Architect, Lieutenant Cole G. Halberg. From the stage, Lucas didn't flinch this time, but his shoulders stiffened, just slightly, as murmurs began to ripple through the audience. And then from the front, General Hargrave rose. He didn't ask for the microphone. He took it, with the kind of quiet authority that made every camera in the room pivot toward him. "Before we proceed," he began, his voice crisp, "there is one correction to the record that must be made." The murmurs stilled into silence. "The tactical brilliance of Operation Hawthorne has long been credited to the officers in the field," Hargrave continued. "But the truth is this: the architect of that mission is not the man at this podium. The true commanding strategist sits among us today." He stepped to the side, and the massive screens behind him changed. Gone was the map. In its place, the first page of the original Hawthorne after-action report appeared, my report, complete, with date, signature, and title. Commanding Officer, Lieutenant Colers Grace Halberg. A second slide followed, the metadata extract, showing every revision and the exact IP address that had altered the file. The evidence filled the wall like a verdict in bold type. The air in the room shifted. Chairs scraped back as people stood, slowly at first, then in unison. The applause began, restrained at first, as though testing the waters, but it built into something undeniable. I rose. Not quickly, not shyly, but with the same deliberate pace I'd used walking through a battlefield. The aisle cleared ahead of me as I moved toward the stage, cameras tracking every step. I didn't glance at Lucas as I passed, though I saw him. From the corner of my eye, still seated, hands folded on the podium, his expression locked into something that wasn't quite neutral. Hargrave met me at the edge of the stage, his hand extended. I took it. I didn't give a speech. I didn't need to. Behind us, the screen still bore my name, my maps, my signature. The truth was up there for the world to see, and for once, no one could edit it out. The applause continued, rolling through the hall in steady waves. Somewhere to my left, a young officer stood with tears in her eyes, whispering something I couldn't hear over the noise. The only words I caught, mouthed between her hands, were, "She's the reason I stayed." I didn't smile. I didn't bow. I simply stood, letting the sound wash over me, letting the evidence speak louder than anything I could say. The moment wasn't about reclaiming a title. It was about making sure the next time someone tried to erase a name, they'd remember how this one reappeared. The hotel suite smelled faintly of roses and something sharper, the kind of antiseptic that makes even expensive air feel staged. My mother sat on the edge of a velvet settee, pearls at her throat, hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look at me when I entered. Her gaze drifted instead to the manila folder I carried, resting it gently on the glass coffee table between us. "I thought perhaps we could talk," she said, her voice carefully measured. "Just the two of us. No cameras, no generals." I didn't sit right away. We had plenty of years to talk without cameras. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "We're still family, Grace." "You said that before," I replied, "the day you asked me to withdraw from the senior officer command track because Lucas needed it more." Her eyes flickered. Guilt, recognition, maybe both. "That's not what I meant." I opened the folder. Inside was the original nomination letter for my promotion, the one she had intercepted. Next to it, a draft email in her handwriting. "Let's delay until Lucas establishes himself. I found this in the printer queue of your home desktop," I said. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the page, but she didn't pick it up. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Of what? Of what your father would say. Of what it would do to our family. You don't understand." "No," I cut in, my voice steady. "You were afraid of being the mother who let her daughter outshine her son." The silence between us thickened. Her eyes brimmed, but her expression didn't soften. "I didn't know how to help you. You've always been so capable. And Lucas needed more." "You didn't help either of us," I said. "You let him believe he was more than he was, and you let me believe I had to earn even basic acknowledgement." Her tears finally fell, the kind that had once unmoored me, made me question my own certainty. But not anymore. "I lost both my children tonight," she whispered. I stood, closing the folder and tucking it under my arm. "No," I said, hand on the door. "You lost the one who never belonged to you in the first place." It was well past midnight when the second knock came. Hesitant, uneven, 3 taps, a pause, then one more. I opened the door to find Lucas standing in the hallway, hands shoved deep in his pockets, tie crooked, the polished confidence of earlier stripped away. "Hi," he said. I stepped aside, and he walked in, stopping just short of the couch. He didn't sit. "I've been thinking," he began, eyes fixed on the floor. "About everything. I used to tell myself it was harmless. Borrowing a little credit, letting people assume." "And when you signed your name onto my report?" I asked. His jaw tightened. At first I told myself it was temporary, that someone would fix it later. But then the awards came, the invites, the press, and it got harder to imagine stepping aside. "So you didn't?" "No," he admitted. Finally, his eyes met mine. They were glassy, unsteady. "Somewhere along the way I convinced myself you didn't care, that if you wanted the credit you would have taken it." I didn't answer. The silence stretched. "I saw your face tonight," he said quietly. "On that screen. I realized I was afraid, not of you, but of what would happen to me if people saw you for what you are. Because the second they did, I'd disappear. I studied him, weighing the confession. And did you? His voice cracked on the answer. Yes, and I deserved it. He took a breath, like he was gathering the last of his nerve. Can you forgive me? I leaned back slightly, keeping my tone even. That's not something I owe you, but I hope one day you'll earn it from yourself. He nodded, eyes dropping again. In the stillness that followed, the unspoken truth sat between us. Some damage isn't reversible. Some wounds don't scar over. They just stay open, teaching you what you can survive. 3 weeks after the ceremony, the Academy's smallest lecture hall smelled faintly of dust and floor polish. The chairs didn't match. The fluorescent lights flickered at random, and the heating system clanked like an old engine. It was exactly the kind of room I'd wanted. Nothing polished, nothing staged, just space for a conversation that mattered. 10 cadets sat in a loose semicircle, uniforms crisp but their postures a mix of formality and nerves. 4 of them were women. 2 still wore training ribbons. One had a wrist brace from a field exercise gone wrong, and another had the kind of steady, unblinking stare I'd once seen in a mirror. This isn't about rank, I began, my voice carrying just enough to reach every corner. It's about what you do before you get it. Some of you have already led without the permission to do so. That means you already know what leadership feels like. They were quiet, but it wasn't disengagement. It was the quiet of people. Listening with both ears and something deeper, the part of them that had been told don't get ahead of yourself and was now hearing the opposite. I asked them a question. What's the first thing they told you that you couldn't do? The answers came slowly at first. Speak up. Take command. Apply for special ops. Disagree. I nodded. And yet you're here, which means you didn't listen. A ripple of small, tentative smiles moved through the group. We talked about tactics, about issuing orders without mimicking the shouting styles of men who mistook volume for authority, about building trust so strong it didn't need to be defended. They asked questions I'd once been too afraid to voice. What if no one believes in me? How do I know I'm ready? What if I fail? You don't wait for belief, I told them. You behave as if it's already there. That's how you build. In yourself and in the people around you. By the end of the session, the air felt different. Not eager, not naive, but anchored. They didn't look like they were waiting for someone to give them permission anymore. The following week, the first of them graduated. Her name was Lieutenant Evelyn Sharp, the same cadet who had asked me once, "What do I do when they say I don't belong here?" At the ceremony, the air was crisp, the spring light pouring through the glass dome and scattering gold across the polished floor. Families filled the seats, cameras flashing as each name was called. When Evelyn's turn came, she stepped forward, eyes forward, back straight. I met her at the edge of the stage, holding the insignia in my hand. Tradition dictated it be pinned over the heart. I didn't. Instead, I pinned it high on her collarbone, where it would be the first thing anyone saw, where it could not be ignored. She didn't flinch. As she stepped back into formation, I looked out over the rows of cadets, the rows of polished faces watching from the audience. Somewhere near the front, Margaret sat with a small American flag folded in her lap. Her expression was calm, but her eyes told me everything. Approval, pride, and something quieter. The knowledge that this was the point of it all. The last name was called, the final salute given, and I returned to the podium. My closing line was simple, deliberate. She was once erased from the program, I said, my gaze sweeping the room, and now she writes the rules others will follow. I stepped back, letting the applause rise, not for me, but for what came next. Because this time, it wasn't about reclaiming a place in the room. It was about making sure no one else would have to fight to be there in the first place.